And we'll see as people join us. So sort of as I was saying before, we're talking about emerging adulthood and just thinking about the ways in which this can look different for different people and the extent to which it sort of reflects what is a period of significant transition for a number of different reasons. And I was starting to talk about the work of Jeffrey Arnett, who's been doing, who sort of really was the first in the field to talk about this as sort of a reconceptualized life stage, I would say. Not that it was new, but that we had come to understand it a little bit in which there have been changing demographics over the past 40 plus years. So the interesting thing about emerging adulthood is that it is, it is a time of life where it's full of both opportunities and challenges. And these 4 criteria were identified in a study by emerging adults as being how they understood adulthood. So when they thought about what does it mean to transition into becoming an adult, there was a consensus that the biggest and most important factor was becoming independent and self-reliant. A second important piece was the ability to form what they sort of refer to as mature relationships. I think one of the key features of those relationships was that there was mutuality in those relationships, that both individuals contributed equally to the relationship. And so it was sort of seen more as collaboration and partnership, which I think is important when thinking about parent emerging adult relationships and how those are navigated during difficult times. Third, and actually this was mentioned quite a bit, I think a little bit, in my view, a bit surprising, but just the ability to comply with societal norms. So things like not engaging in drunk driving or generally following what is, what are sort of legally sanctioned ways of behaving. That's tended to come up quite a lot for people. And then the last key piece was being able to provide for and care for a family. I thought it might be helpful just to talk a little bit about what in the literature is oftentimes discussed as some of the challenges of emerging adulthood. And I think that these challenges, if we think about them in the context of the current situation, they're really heightened. So not only are these challenges that exist already for people who are going through this time of life, but also when we add on some of the specific challenges of COVID-19 and the ways in which that's changing experiences, what we're going to find is that these challenges are further exacerbated. And the reason I wanted to give this talk, as I started before, was because I do think that this is a sort of subset of the population who is likely to experience very unique and specific challenges associated with what is currently happening, and may very well experience challenges not just now, but going forward. And so I think it will be particularly important to consider what the needs are of this population as we think about what kinds of strategies are going to be implemented sort of post this acute phase of COVID-19, and more thinking through what has to happen over the next year or even several years. So even without the context of COVID-19, this is a challenging time for a variety of reasons. So we're talking about people who are really in the phase of life where they're thinking through what is their career going to look like. And when we think about some of the changes associated with emerging adulthood, that now more than ever required to enter the labor force and to do it in a way that feels meaningful and provides people with the kind of job security that they're looking for. I think there's also a lot of pressure during this time of life to find that right career path. And in part, this is kind of paved the way by generations before the current emerging adult generation, where people tended to stay in careers for 10, 15, 20 years. I don't think that's necessarily true of emerging adults now. But that's sort of their models for what does a career look like. And there's a lot of fear that if I don't make the right choice now, am I stuck on a path that I'm not going to be able to get out of? There's also the question of whether or not there will be jobs available for emerging adults as they graduate from post-secondary institutions. So because there has been some holding off of retirements from the baby boomer generation, that means there have been less job opportunities open for emerging adults, and that's created additional stress. And the kinds of jobs that emerging adults oftentimes find themselves in are consistently contract work where there's a high potential for layoffs. And I'm going to come up to this shortly, but that's been a huge impact in terms of thinking about COVID-19, because one of the features that's happened, oh, I see a chat. One of the features that's happened during COVID-19 is that the first group of workers to be laid off were people who are working in service sectors, for example, and oftentimes those were emerging adults. So they've been disproportionately impacted by the kinds of unemployment that's happened the past little while. Another key current situation is that it is a time of identity exploration and sort of this feature of lost and found identity, where in childhood, self-worth is oftentimes gained through external reinforcement. So lessons get a lot of reinforcement and other activities where there's the opportunity to get positive feedback. But starting in emerging adulthood, that type of positive feedback doesn't come as frequently as it has before. And so there's a much greater opportunity to turn in and look to oneself for validation and reinforcement. And sometimes when that's removed, that can lead to sort of a loss of self-identity without having those external reinforcers to let us know how we're doing well in various parts of our lives. Oftentimes there's a question of, am I actually succeeding? Am I becoming the person I want to be? And for that reason, this time of life has oftentimes been referred to as sort of the quarter life crisis, that at this stage of life, there's a question and oftentimes that can be associated with significant distress. Again, if we think about where COVID-19 fits into that, oftentimes we may be seeing a prolonging of various milestones that tend to support people's identity development. So for example, with career being an aspect of an individual's identity. Even thinking about what the impact may be on some longer term relationships. So where long-term partnerships are being established during this time of life, the impact of COVID-19 has been that some of those newly emerging relationships are put into limbo because there aren't opportunities to be together and to sort of start to enact roles within relationships. And that complicates things, especially for people who are just starting to form more intimate relationships. And I've heard that from a lot of emerging adults too, sort of the uneasiness that's coming with having started a relationship just before COVID-19 began, and now questioning whether that relationship is in fact as secure as maybe the person felt it was before this started. And then finally, this is a time of life that tends to be associated with greater isolation and in some cases a lack of faith. So emerging adults spend more time alone than any other age group except for older adults. And I think when we think about COVID-19 and the ways in which it's contributing to social isolation, there's also a piece of exacerbation. So even greater isolation when opportunities to be with other people are more limited. They are the generation that is sort of constantly connected. They're digital natives. They've grown up with smartphones in their lives. And generally, when we think about what happens during this time of life, there's a normative reevaluation of faith and beliefs, which can be both important in terms of self-development, but also can be disconcerting in terms of, again, losing an aspect of one's community that was an important part of childhood and family involvement. So all of the stress that comes with attempting to make separations between oneself and family of origin or community of origin gets exacerbated during this time of life. And lastly, I sort of already commented on this, but just in terms of thinking about interpersonal relationships, these are really critical during periods of transition in general. So we know that for emerging adults, when they have supportive, healthy relationships, that's very important for healthy development. And relationships through all stages of life are oftentimes used for comfort and support. But when there are difficulties in relationship, when there are struggles and there's a sense that there's a lack of support network during this difficult time, that creates further challenges. And again, as I mentioned before, when we think about the challenges of COVID-19, here's another situation that's creating greater disconnection, perhaps greater isolation, and maybe even more narrowing of the social network. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to either raise your hand or put something in the chat, and I'll monitor as we go too. Okay, so here's where we think about the fact that, you know, what's currently happening is a potential added stressor. And I think everyone's experience of what's going on now is very different, and certainly not all emerging adults are going to, you know, sort of perceive this time of life as perceive sort of the current situation as something that may induce increasing stress. In fact, I would say I've heard from a lot of emerging adults, I think, especially for ones who tend to be more comfortable with greater amounts of time alone and feel pressure to socialize, but otherwise don't generally have a tendency to want to do that. For them, there may be sort of some comfort in feeling like they can disconnect, and that that's normative in terms of what's going on right now. For others, I think there's a number of factors that are contributing to greater stress. One is that now there's an increase in uncertainty around what's already an uncertain time of life. So here we're talking about a generation that's shifting and starting to think about transitions. And there's an added layer of uncertainty with not knowing what things are going to look like for the next. Well, for sure. And so that creates an even greater worry for those who may have already been worried about where they're going to land. So 18 to 29-year-olds were really among the first employees to experience job loss as a result of COVID-19. And as I mentioned, they had been disproportionately affected by lost jobs because they're the subset of the population that takes up most jobs in the sales and service sectors. And those were the sectors that experienced the largest impact earliest on. So oftentimes it's been emerging adults who have gone the longest now without being employed. And again, the uncertainty of when they'll have an opportunity to be back into the job market and what that job market will actually look like when they are back at work. The other piece that I've mentioned, and one of the reasons why I want to talk about parent emerging adult relationships today, is that I think a lot of emerging adults have responded to what's gone on by moving back home. So moving back home for a variety of reasons. One, because there's a financial saving to moving back home. So for emerging adults who found themselves unemployed unexpectedly, there was a need for financial reasons to be back in a place where they weren't paying rent, especially when we think about Toronto and the very high cost of living here. And lots of people returned to families, maybe on the outskirts of Toronto or in the suburbs, where there were opportunities to live at home rent-free or for reduced rent. But that created more separation from sort of the life that they had been building for themselves if they were kind of in the city. The other thing about being home is that during times of uncertainty and instability, oftentimes people seek out what's familiar and comfortable, and home feels that way for a lot of people. Not for everybody, certainly not for everybody, but for a number of people where home is safe and secure, the familiarity of being back there was what they needed in order to help sort of provide soothing and calm some of the discomfort associated with all of the uncertainty that's been happening right now. And that there was an opportunity for connections. So I think emerging adults who were living alone, there was sort of no person-to-person connection that was available to them anymore if they were staying in residences where they were alone. And so being back at home at least provided the person-to-person connection that could happen with other family members, so they didn't feel completely disconnected. So this was a way to help deal with some of the social isolation or loneliness that might have been coming about, especially if they were living on their own away from family. So where do parents come into the bigger picture in terms of thinking about emerging adults and what it's like to move back with parents for maybe, as I said, an extended or unexpected period of time? Well, the research on parent emerging adult relationships is actually not quite as well developed as sort of other areas of research in thinking about parent-child relationships. This is, I think, a really nice quote in terms of thinking about what happens to parent-child relationships and ways in which those relationships, like the time of life, is a period of transition. So successful stage transition resulting in a more differentiated and integrated level of adaptation in young adulthood can occur only through personal commitment to courses of thought and action that depart from early, more stable and secure patterns, and accommodation by parents and other significant adults to the changing status of the child. So the fact that parents, like emerging adults, are needing to transition in thinking about a new relationship emerging, one that moves away from patterns that may have been established in childhood and even adolescence, and considers new ways that parents and emerging adults can interact that speak to the way emerging adults are, or the stage that emerging adults are at in terms of their lives. And again, that can be difficult, and it can be particularly difficult, or at least more saliently difficult, when parents and emerging adults are back to find bases for longer periods of time than either anticipated. Now, the truth is that it's not completely unique to COVID-19. We know that more than ever, people are staying at home, living with parents for much longer than they had ever been in the past. So about 35% of individuals ages 20 to 34 in Canada continue to still live with their parents. And there's some ranges. A lot, when you look at Toronto, the rates are higher for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes there are sort of cultural norms around staying at home with parents longer, and so that keeps people with their parents maybe well into their 30s. There's also the high cost of living in Toronto that makes it financially not feasible for people to actually move out of parents' houses. A lot of reasons why people stay home longer with parents now than they may have before. As I said, there's much less attention in the research literature to the nature of parent-child relationships emerging adulthood. But I think these are important things to think about. And of course, as a researcher and a clinician, I'm always interested in how we can think about these things together, especially in considering how do parent emerging adult relationships look in the context of COVID-19 and what's going to be helpful. One of the ways in which we think about what is likely helpful for emerging adults and parents during this time of life is finding this balance between relaxing control, because that's healthy and supportive of development and where they are, and continuing to offer scaffolding. So it's not as though parents completely remove themselves and become uninvolved, but the scaffolding that they offer needs to be consistent with where the emerging adult child is in terms of their lives. The truth is that oftentimes parents and emerging adults both think the same thing about what adulthood looks like. So when they ask, in a survey, when they ask parents and emerging what were the most important aspects of adulthood, both agreed that relational maturity, so accepting responsibility for the consequences of their actions, was a key feature of what adults generally do. And both agreed that norm compliance was important, although they had sort of different degrees of agreeing with respect to specific aspects of norm compliance. But interestingly, if you look at the fourth sort of point on this table, that emerging adults felt that in order to be an adult, they had to be financially independent. Whereas adults felt that whereas parents felt that emerging adults, in order to become adults, should be less self-oriented and develop greater consideration for others. And one of the reasons that the authors came up with for that finding was that parents wanted the relationship with their emerging adult child to look different, and that for whatever reason they felt that they wanted emerging adults to have maybe more consideration for them and more consideration for how they feel as parents of an emerging adult. In terms of thinking about the relationship, one of the things that's also key is that parents that parents do have some involvement, and that, as researchers and as clinicians, we really can't lose sight of the fact that there is a prior history of interacting. It's not as though we erase everything that's happened up until that point and start at emerging adulthood. But that being said, there are some differences that can be established during this time of life. And in fact, we're doing some research now that shows that what happens day to day with parents and their emerging adults has more of an impact than what might have happened historically in terms of thinking about the emerging adults' day-to-day mental health and well-being. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that research now. But in terms of parents, that oftentimes for parents, they feel the need to help their children navigate this period. And really, this is a new stage of the parent-child relationship. And for most emerging adults and parents, the leaving of home or like the emerging adult child moving out really becomes a catalyst for more individuated relationships. It's one of the factors that really helps support a new relationship, because there's, the relationship must change. No longer is it the case that everything is happening within the home and you can be guaranteed constant contact. The nature of the relationship changes as soon as the emerging leaves home. And oftentimes that's associated with decreased conflict. And many emerging adults and parents report that when the emerging adult leaves home, there's actually improvement in the relationship, that the way in which they interact with each other gets better because there is more space between them. So this really can become an opportunity for relationship transformation. And again, it speaks to how the current situation where emerging adults are finding themselves at home more than they thought they would is creating increasing tension for families. What is the kind of parenting that works best during emerging adulthood? This isn't surprising. I think this is true in adolescence as well, but especially in emerging adulthood, the kind of parenting that tends to be most helpful is autonomy supportive parenting. So this is when there's sort of this dance between closeness and warmth within the relationships, but also that there's a focus on supporting autonomy in the life of the emerging adult. And that comes through parents having a real belief that their child has agency and are able to act in responsible ways. A key feature of that autonomy supportive relationship is also empathy on both sides. So autonomy supportive parents can take the perspective of their emerging adult child and use that to support them. And on the other hand, when there's good relationships between emerging adults and their parents, oftentimes it's because the emerging adult also has empathy and an understanding of their parent and where they're at in terms of thinking. So just to tell you a little bit about some of the work we're doing in our lab, and then I'm going to talk about specific strategies. This really speaks to the nature of relationships as they exist day to day between emerging adults and their parents. We do a lot of research that looks at daily diary data collection, which means we ask people to tell us about their experiences at least once a day. And in this study, we wanted to know a bit more about how do parents and emerging adults interact each day, and what is the impact of those interactions on experiences of mood and well-being, and then over time to look at mental health and substance use outcomes as well. So most studies on parent-child relationships tend to focus on more distal factors. So they tend to focus on things like attachment and overall patterns of autonomy, supportive, warmth, helicopter parenting. Those tend to be common factors that are looked at in the research. And those certain that there's a history of 18 years of interacting that we can't neglect as we think about what's important for parents and emerging adults. But there's not a lot of research on what are the specific dynamics. So these are things that are going to be changing day to day, and the proximal factors that influence behaviors as they unfold in daily life. And a lot of our research is based on self-determination theory, which is a theory of well-being and motivation that focuses on three components being critical for healthy development. And those are competence, so the extent to which one has a belief in their own self-efficacy; relatedness, how sort of connected another person feels to others in their life; and then autonomy, the extent to which someone feels that they're free to make their own choices. And in our research, we've been very interested in how parent-emerging adult relationships can bolster these three psychological needs to support well-being. And I think when we think about what households, the extent to which these three psychological needs are being met can change even throughout a day or days spending time with other people. And so we're interested in understanding how those needs do change and how that impacts well-being. So this is from our study where we looked at day-to-day interactions and asked people, these were all emerging adults, we asked them to tell us how often they had been, or to what degree they had felt criticized by a parent in that day, how often their parents sort of insisted they take action on something, which was sort of part of a factor of thinking about more controlling parenting, how often they felt allowed to express themselves, how often they felt listened to, and how often a parent provided guidance on a topic. And the most frequent report was that emerging adults felt listened to by parents, and much less of the time did they feel criticized, although they certainly did also note that they had experiences with parents where they felt criticized. But the thing they experienced most was that they did feel listened to by their parents. And then we looked at how much those experiences contributed to those 3 psychological needs in self-determination theory. I'm not going to get too much into how we looked at things, but just the note that the more that emerging adults felt listened to, that they felt they could assert themselves, that they felt connected to their parents, the more relatedness they felt, so the greater that connection felt to parents. The more that parents engaged in what we classified as sort of controlling behavior, where they insisted that their emerging adult child take action on something, the less competent the emerging adult felt that day, and the more criticized the emerging adult felt, the less autonomy they felt they had that day. So the factors that tend to support wellness and well-being were lessened when parents insisted that their emerging adult child took action, or when they felt criticized. And similar findings in terms of looking at different outcomes. So when emerging adults felt more criticized by parents, that impacted their mood. They had much higher negative affect. On days where they spent more time with their parents and they felt listened to, they're at higher. And on days where they felt criticized, their overall well-being was also rated as lower. So clearly, what happens day to day with parents and their emerging adult children impacts the way in which their emerging adult child feels that day. Those day-to-day interactions are important in terms of understanding what happens day to day with respect to mood and well-being. So feelings of support were heightened on days that emerging adults felt listened to and supported, and mood and well-being were also impacted. So when you have a parent who listens, that's important for well-being and positive feelings. And on the opposite end, feeling criticized by a parent can impact negative mood and negatively impact well-being. I have a note here that there was no moderating effect of more stable parent-child relationship factors. And essentially what that means is that while historical factors are certainly important in terms of thinking about how relationships are shaped over time, in terms of the day-to-day relationship between what happens with interactions with parents and how the emerging adult child feels that day, those past experiences don't have a significant impact on that day-to-day relationship. So what that tells us is that it matters what happens day-to-day, almost despite whatever has existed up until that point. Those day-to-day interactions are critical for how an emerging adult feels during that day. So what does this tell us about the current situation, and what may be important to consider when we're thinking about coping and COVID-19? The key feature of emerging adult relationships with parents that tends to create the most positive experiences is having autonomy supportive relationships. And that means a few things. It also means that there are going to be challenges for emerging adults who are moving back in with parents, where maybe that feature of the relationship didn't exist prior to them being back at home. So one thing that is critical is setting healthy boundaries with parents, and both parents and emerging adults having kind of clear expectations around the relationship and around what's happening at home while everybody is living together. So that means clear conversations around what's expected, both as far as taking care of things around the house, and also having healthy boundaries around where time needs to be time for on their own versus time that's going to be time together. Because emerging adulthood is a time of increasing reciprocity, and what that means is that essentially both people within the relationship contribute more equally to the relationship, it's an important time for emerging adults to sort of adults. Essentially, that means oftentimes when emerging adults and when anyone returns home, sometimes we regress into sort of patterns that we had established earlier on in life. And I think that's especially true when returning to childhood home, because all of the ways in which things existed within that home are sort of re-triggered in being back there. And so really kind of being mindful around maintaining the ways in which you want to interact with other people in your life in your relationship with parents. So kind of bringing your, bringing adultness into that relationship, and kind of maintaining that piece of the relationship is important for reestablishing a healthy relationship, if maybe one didn't exist before, or if maybe this is, again, the first time that there's a more prolonged period of being together at home. I generally sort of provide this suggestion in general, which is avoid avoiding. So, if there are uncomfortable topics in terms of either or challenges, that avoiding those topics doesn't generally work over time to maintain healthy relationships. And so making sure that if there is a tendency to want to avoid, to sort of reflect on what it is that's being avoided and use it as an opportunity to approach and to consider what it is that needs to be discussed and how can those things be communicated more effectively. The next piece is really about having an empathic stance towards parents. So one of the things that I think happens in later adolescence and oftentimes in emerging adulthood is a recognition that parents are actually flawed humans, just as we are all flawed humans. Certainly in childhood, we don't necessarily see that. We see our parents as parents. We don't really see them as sort of, humans who kind of operate individually in their own lives. And so one of the things that helps to create reciprocity in a relationship is the recognition that, as humans exist in the world just the way that emerging adults do, parents too are flawed. And so recognizing those flaws and sort of appreciating them in some ways can oftentimes be helpful for establishing more reciprocal relationships. I know a lot of emerging adults are back at home and working, either doing schoolwork or perhaps doing some work from home if they're employed in situations where they can still work from home. And finding space in the house or in the shared space is an important thing. So you may need to find ways to be creative. It may not be that there are, huge amounts of space because these are shared spaces now, but a way to sort of even find your own nook in the house or in the living room or wherever it can be, that is the space that you can do your work and feels like there are boundaries established as this is sort of a space where people aren't going to come into or aren't going to be interrupting, be identified as this is the space where I'm going to do my work. I think in general that it's important to recognize that there are heightened emotions for everybody. I think our overall kind of the idea about our windows of tolerance and the extent to which additional stress is added on to what's already a heightened level of stress, that's very important to recognize that. And so those heightened emotions can oftentimes lead to reactions that are atypical or that are more intense than would otherwise be. And so just important to be able to let things go, maybe more now than one would likely to do if the current situation sort of wasn't causing as much stress as it is. Part of reciprocity in relationships also means contributing day-to-day household tasks. So part of what can happen when those expectations are set around sort of what it's like to live together again and what that can look like is how is each person in the house contribute to what happens in the house, that there's a sense that those responsibilities are going to be shared among all of the members who are living at home. And then the last two things that I think I'm hearing a lot more of from people is one, that there tends to be sort of a return to shared interests. So, things like watching a show together or doing a puzzle together or playing board games, whatever it is, oftentimes being back at home allows an opportunity to have those shared interests come back into each other's lives. And that can be very beneficial to the relationship. Plus, now there's an opportunity to introduce parents to new interests. So things that they may not have known about before, new shows, films that you've seen that you think might interest your parents, a book you're reading, whatever it is, an opportunity to sort of share something new and have that be kind of a new piece of the relationship that maybe didn't exist before. Okay, so those are all sort of my general points. I thought if we have if there are questions or ways in which people themselves are sort of managing, if that's the situation for them, this would be a good time to talk about those things. or not.
Abby, thank you so much for this great presentation. I really appreciate it. One thing I was wondering about is with some of my clients who might have a parent relationship where they are criticized more, and there's less autonomy and control sort of to that kind of style of parenting that you were talking about.
Yes.
And now with COVID going on and they having so much more interaction with their parents, I'm wondering if you anticipate like some more increases in those parent-child like difficulties because of just the increased contact with them.
Absolutely. I think where there have been sort of problems in relationships prior to the current situation, unfortunately, those two are going to be exacerbated. I mean, we certainly, know that more time with people, exposure, and when there have been some of those ways of interacting in the past that have been problematic um, and poor communication or criticism, that yes, those things will also increase because there's more opportunity to be around those people, and so so I agree, those communications are likely to increase. I mean, and I think that's where sort of expectations and boundaries are particularly important. It can be it's not the case that every parent is necessarily going to be accepting of those, but I think there's a lot to be said for repetition and sort of modeling. So to the extent that there's the ability to take that space, take space to oneself, to, as I said, sort of make spaces clearly one's own, and to be able to communicate for the emerging adults to be able to communicate what their needs are as effectively as they can. And repetition is necessary, especially when people are learning new patterns of relating, that may be an important piece of trying to impart new ways of relating when old patterns are really not working, both for the emerging adult and for the parent.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, so why don't we end it here?